Today we're going to talk about Fade and whether Fade is bad. Well, no, she's obviously not bad, but we're here on this state of the game for the agents that Riot made in September, because what I want to talk about is the danger of Fade's design, and how Fade really needs to be a one-off, in my opinion, when it comes to her design and why she was designed the way she was. So they mention in this state of the agents, with the addition of Fade, we've seen competition among picks when compared to previous month, where Sova dominated the recon space. Well, we're happy to see players have another choice in their role. We also think there are areas like clearing spaces where she's overperforming. So basically they were talking about, Fade being a bit too good, but also crucially, they wanted Fade to be a direct competitor to Sova in the recon space. That is what they clearly spelled it out here. They wanted Fade to directly compete with Sova. And let me talk about why that is potentially dangerous if they continue to do stuff like that going forward. So obviously it's not rocket science that if you have an agent who is performing pretty well, like Sova was, this is from Masters Reykjavik, just the tournament that came just before Fade came out, you're going to end up with an agent who's, doing pretty well, almost a 50% pick rate here. If we go back even further, Sova's pick rate would be even higher and higher and higher, to be honest. And so, you've got this agent that is performing well, you add in a direct competitor, and of course, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen, and this is the pick rate from Champions here, the last tournament, Sova's pick rate has gone down. But Sova, you'll still notice, is at 33%, which is a very healthy pick rate overall. Fade is doing, remarkably well at 53%, but, Sova's still doing okay. It's not like Sova doesn't get played or anything, so, you might see that overall, the decision they made for Fade and Sova wasn't too bad. And I actually agree that it wasn't too bad overall, and that, Sova still lives on and Fade is doing pretty well. Maybe she'll get a nerf fairly soon, and, they'll be even more balanced, and, those pick rates will come even closer together. But the reason that those can still survive, the reason that Fade and Sova can still survive overall, is because of the importance of that recon space. Recon abilities and what Fade and Sova provide to, your team in terms of information and whatnot is super powerful in a game like Valorant. It's just really, really strong. And that is why Sova and Fade have seen really, really high pick rates throughout their time in the game, because it's a really strong ability. And so Sova can afford to have a direct competitor, with slight differences. If we look at a Sova dart versus a Fade haunt, they functionally do pretty much the exact same thing. The only major difference, in my opinion, is the range that you can, send them out, right? Fade has a more limited range, whereas Sova can send a dart very, very far, right? And to make up for that, Fade has 2 prowlers opposed to 1 drone for Sova. And, again, those 2 abilities are doing pretty much the same thing, right? The prowlers and the drone, they're pretty irreplaceable. Obviously, you do get some differences with the shock darts versus the Cs, and the 2 ults are a bit different as well. So there are some differences between the agents, but the main primary core function of those agents is very, very similar. And to me, there's only one other space that we've seen where an agent has come in and directly challenged another agent, and it's been okay. And that was the operator role, where we saw obviously Jett go from dominating the game, but then with the introduction of Chamber slowly but surely, and with Jett nerfs as well, but then also Chamber nerfs, we've seen that both agents have been able to survive and stay healthy in the meta, and Chamber will probably get nerfed again. And to be honest, if Chamber goes down after a big nerf, Jett will probably come up a bit more, and we'll try and get that balance and harmony between them as well. But this to me was a bit different to Sova and Fade, because they do play, whilst they are similar on the defensive side in terms of that operator role, on the attacking side they do play out very, very differently. Chamber will often be a lurker, whereas Jett obviously is your entry in onto site. So they've very much had different roles on that side. Whereas on the defensive side, yeah, sure, they might be a bit similar, but that was overall okay because they weren't necessarily always directly competing each other like a Fade and a Sova might. And even so, the operator role is so important to a game that, again, it's perfectly fine to have direct competition for that role overall, because it's kind of necessary or seem as necessary at the highest levels of the game, and so both agents will still see a ton of play no matter what. But then recently we got the introduction of Harbor, and Harbor versus Viper I think is very different to a Jett versus Chamber or a Sova versus Fade, and I'm very glad that the devs have done this, because you have to ask yourself the question, is there a need to have two wall smokers in the same team comp, right? Because that's the thing. We've seen Jet and Chamber be played together. On Breeze, it's kind of the meta to play both Jet and Chamber together. On Ascent, we've seen a ton of teams play both Sova and Fade, and that is because those roles of opping and those roles of, information gathering and revealing your opponent are extremely important to the game and are just extremely strong roles to have. Whereas, is there ever a need to have two wall smokers in a team comp? Well, maybe you could do some interesting, tricky things with Viper plus Harbor, but I don't see it becoming like the meta anytime tomorrow, so probably not so much. And that is why I think the introduction of Harbor and how Harbor versus Viper is handled was very, very well done by the Riot devs overall. Because if we take a look at Harbor versus Viper, unlike that Sova versus Fade, where I'm talking about, oh, look, their E abilities are practically the same outside of the range of it, and oh, look, their, drone or / prowler thing is, pretty similar as well. When we take a look at Harbor versus Viper, that is just not the case, right? Yes, they both have a wall smoke, but one is measured by fuel. One can only be placed down for where it is, and then it's there for the rest of the round in Viper, whereas Harbor, you can curve that wall. It goes off after time rather than fuel. You'll get it back, and it'll recharge, and you can use it again later in the round if you wish. Very, very practically different. Yes, one has a slow, one has a decay, minor differences overall in terms of what happens when you go through them, but they are practically, functionally pretty different. But then the rest of the kits of those agents is completely on, separate terms, right? They just completely do different things. Viper is very, very good at stalling and delaying with the orb and the mollies and the ult as well, and holding down a space. Whereas the main weakness of Harbor is holding down a space. You have to be very proactive with Harbor. You have to be, willing to kind of push the bounds and, kind of use your utility to get into spaces and whatnot. So in terms of that space, in terms of the rest of the kit, they are completely functionally different. And that is very, very important because, as I mentioned, the recon space, the operator space, that is strong enough and is fundamental enough to the game to warrant having, a direct competition for that space. Something like a wall smoke agent, that isn't. And so you need to have enough difference between those agents to where you'll say, if we're playing Viper, we're playing a different comp than if we were playing Harbor, right? Where those agents are fundamentally going to be played out so differently that you might actually change the rest of the comp to fit more with, if you're playing Harbor, you're playing a very proactive comp, whereas if you're playing Viper, you might play a much more reactive comp in general and more of a stally comp and whatnot. With Viper, and I think that is the key difference. And as we go forward as well, it wouldn't surprise me if the next agents in the game, if the next Sentinel in the game is, something that challenges Sage, right? Sage kind of exists in her own space at the moment. Maybe the next agent is something to try and challenge that, right? Well, to me, Sage's role in the game isn't important enough to have a Sova versus Fade. We need a Viper versus Harbor if we're going to introduce an agent who's like Sage. Or we might introduce a duelist like Raze, where, again, to me, Raze's role, while she is a good agent, her role isn't important enough to definitely say, oh, we need to have, someone who's very similar to Raze. No, we need Raze with a different flair, perhaps a completely different flair, like a Viper versus Harbor. And so far, I think the devs have done a good job. They've done a good job in terms of recognizing what roles are so fundamental and core to the game that they can survive having a direct competitor. Because I think, honestly, we might have run out of those, agents who kind of challenge design space. And as we add more agents into the game, of course, we are going to have agents that challenge other agents' design space, because there just won't be enough space for everyone. So someone's going to have to get challenged. We need to see more Viper versus Harbor, where, there are clear fundamental differences in how you want to play that agent, and therefore how you might want to construct the rest of your team comp as well to fit how that agent's playstyle goes together. And so I'm hoping that Riot, will do that, because otherwise we will end up with situations where, one agent is just going to get cannibalized out of the game, right? If Harbor and Viper were extremely similar in the way that they played overall, whoever was deemed to be better would just always get picked and the other one won't. You might even say that, that could be somewhat true, but I think because Harbor has enough difference to Viper, that situation has somewhat been avoided and will be avoided going forward. Whereas if they were just in that same space, kind of like a Sova and Fade, probably one of them would never be seeing any play. So I'm glad that Riot has seemed to recognize what roles are strong enough to survive that and aren't, but I hope that that is the case going forward.